In a lot of ways, the Ghostbusters franchise is notorious for putting their wildly unique science fiction concept in the background in favor of a focus on character and comedy in their films.
You know, for us, it's always going to be about character, and then secondarily, it's going to be about the pseudoscience of it.
Now, don't get me wrong here, as a huge Ghostbusters fan myself, I obviously recognize this focus on character almost certainly plays a massive role in the success of these films, but fans of the science fiction behind Ghostbusters, like the particle accelerators, the charged ions, the laser grid ghost jail, are often pretty starved for content regarding the pseudoscience of this equipment. For example, if I were to look up how a lightsaber works in Star Wars, I'd get a million detailed breakdowns of the lore that all seem to agree with one another more or less on the combinations of a kyber crystal, power cell, energy gate, and so on. Most of this information is provided directly from the lore of Star Wars and provides fans with a satisfying explanation of the future tech they see on screen. With Ghostbusters, almost nothing is mentioned directly in the primary film canon about the function of their insane equipment. In the first film, they just kinda walk through the door in full gear at the start of a new scene with no warning and give us small passing lines about the equipment like,
"Now you'll never slime a guy with a positron collider, huh?"
Each of us is wearing an unlicensed nuclear accelerator on his back.
Total protonic reversal.
All right, that's bad. Okay.
And all those clips are just talking about the Proton pack. It's almost unbelievable for me to sit here and say that the quintessential part of the Ghostbusters arsenal, the piece of equipment that's single-handedly responsible for the capture of the ghost by these guys who professionally capture ghosts, gets no mention in the original film other than a warning to not look at it when it's open. That's it.
I looked at the trap, Ray.
But that's where I come in. I've set out on a journey over the past 8 months to combine the best fan theories with what we know as fact in the primary canon to create a single definitive idea on how the ghost trap works in the Ghostbusters universe. Now, considering the length of this video, you can probably assume that wasn't such an easy task to accomplish. During my research for this video, I've encountered tons of different interpretations on how the ghost trap might actually function in universe, including concepts like ionizing radiation, muonic hydrogen, torque pressure, laser grids, electromagnets, infinite improbability drives, and a laundry list of other things spanning across multiple articles, books, videos, forum posts, film props, games, and Reddit threads. My goal here is to use the best of these theories, based on impact in the community and plausibility based on real-world particle physics, to the best of my ability. I think now is a better time than ever to mention that I am not a particle physicist, or scientist, or even a college graduate, even if I'm ultimately trying to explain the ill-defined pseudoscience behind a box that's capable of imprisoning a ghost in an 80s movie. But you know who else didn't have scientific background before making science entertainment too? And that's right. Bill Nye. So I'm basically just as qualified as anyone else to be here right now. All jokes aside though, I really did do my homework for this video, about 8 months of homework in fact. So before we get into the nitty gritty of the trap's functionality, I want to establish the main sources I used, as I believe it's important to know that I'm not pulling these concepts out of my ass. And also I believe that the people involved with the creation of these posts, videos, and books I'm about to pull from deserve all the credit they can get. Some of these sources are intrinsically linked and use ideas from each other as well. After that, I'll establish some laws that I've come up with to outline the concepts that are so important they have to be included no matter what, based on the knowledge from my sources. And then we'll start digging into the trap's logistics. So if long-form content just is not your thing, and you really just want to get started on the important functions of the inside of the ghost trap without an hour worth of context, please click this timestamp right here. I'll also provide another one too that'll skip straight to the summary of everything I mentioned in this video, top to bottom, that plays towards the end. And with all that said, I'm Muonic. Welcome to my channel, and let's get into some pseudoscience. So for my first source, I need to introduce you to this forum post on GBFans.com by a user named OneTime. This post is aptly titled Muon Trap Operating Manual, and is basically the incredibly detailed interpretation of what all the knobs and dials seen on the front and sides of the trap do based on the abbreviated labels seen on the screen used props. He also scratches the surface on how the trap functions by introducing the concept of ionizing radiation being produced by the trap for what I'm assuming is the first time, as I haven't found anything else before this mentioning radiation while discussing the trap other than talks of ghosts being radioactive themselves. OneTime's detail in this is just absolutely insane, and is about as credible of a source as I can come by, because after reading through the continuation of this post from several months ago, his manual apparently caught the attention of Ghost Corps executive Eric Reich, who, based on what I've read here, seemed to have contacted OneTime to use his ideas in the creation of some of the Frozen Empire props we see in the film. The result of this correspondence actually leads me to my next source, the Frozen Empire equipment schematics. Now these are kind of the holy grail when it comes to separating fact from fan theory, and I'm just really happy that they exist. Basically, these schematic papers are screen-used props from Frozen Empire, and will function as my primary source of information throughout this video. From what I can see after rewatching Frozen Empire a few times, these sketches only appear in the scene where Winston, Janine, and Lars try to explain the containment unit to the main cast. In this scene, only the parts that detail the containment unit are shown, alongside some of the drawings of the Proton Pack's cyclotron. As we see in Adam Savage's Firehouse Upstairs set tour video, the rest of these schematic pages were created and used as set dressing. I believe this is the first time anything's been shown detailing the function of the Ghostbusters equipment in any of the mainline canon films, other than what we can infer from the few passing lines of dialogue, like,
They should. Power cells have a half-life of 5,000 years.
And then these physicists showed up with these portable proton accelerators.
So the significance of these props is just incredible. It really, them just existing can't be understated. I do recognize that these props were mainly used as background set pieces and do have some continuity errors, which I will get into later, but this is the closest we've come to a straight explanation of how this equipment works in-universe, so I'm holding these relatively throwaway prop pages to a pretty high standard. It's also worth mentioning that the same scribbles seen on these pages have made their way into more recent Ghostbusters releases, such as the blueprints that we see coming with the HasLab 2-in-the-box release this fall. Anyway, as I just previously mentioned, Ghost Corps took a huge chunk of OneTime's Muon Trap manual to use for the notes written in-universe by Egon on these Ghost Trap pages. All these highlighted parts you see on screen right now are sourced directly from OneTime's post, so you can get a visual idea of his influence on this. I'll be heavily referencing this page on the Ghost Trap specifically to really help define the operation of the trap in the primary canon moving forward. Also, huge shout out to GhostbustersReferenceLibrary.com for all these images regarding the schematic props, and for really just existing at all. Be sure to check them out. I'll be linking all the sources for this video in my description. Moving on from these, I'll bring your attention to the YouTube videos now. As far as I'm aware, there are only 2 major videos on YouTube that address the trap's functionality. I found a third that I'll mention later, and there could be more, but there's 2 major ones with tens of thousands of views. The first one is How Does the Ghost Trap Work by Channeling Spirits, and the second is How It Works, The Ghost Trap by Ghostbusters NorthWest. Both of these videos are amazing and great interpretations of the trap's in-universe function. The Ghostbusters NorthWest video is a fun in-universe training video that uses a lot of concepts put forth by OneTime's forum post. The Channeling Spirits video is a bit more complex, as the explanations they provide are pretty detailed and completely unique, but they don't really source where they got the information other than listing out general websites like GBFans.com and the Ghostbusters wiki in the description. Still an incredible video though, and it seems to be the most popular source of information on this topic, with the video currently sitting at about 58,000 views at the time of this recording. Many concepts made popular by this video are included in the Frozen Empire schematics shown here as well. Links to both videos will be in the description, as I mentioned before, and I would definitely recommend checking them out if you're interested in the topic. Next up is books. I'm primarily going to use 2 books as sources for this video. The first is Ghostbusters: The Ultimate Visual History by Daniel Wallace. I use this one as a general reference for prop images, but it also has some great quotes from the cast and crew of the original films, as you saw at the beginning of the video. Next up is Ghostbusters Ectomobile Workshop Manual by Troy Benjamin and Mark Sumerak. This book is officially licensed by Ghost Corps, so it's sometimes considered to be canon, but not really, since it was released in 2017 and doesn't include what we know now from Afterlife and Frozen Empire. Regardless, it's written like an in-universe technical manual for the Ecto-1 and the entirety of the Ghostbusters arsenal, including the trap. I'll be using this book as reference pretty frequently too, as it introduces some cool concepts across the 6 whole pages it has dedicated to the explanation of the Ghost Trap's operation, most of which are pretty unique to this book. And lastly, I'll be referencing a series of forum posts, Reddit threads, articles, tie-in merch, interviews, and other miscellaneous videos that I'll credit when I get to them. Alright, so now that we know that I did indeed do my homework, and I'm definitely not pulling this out of my
Ghost.
I'll now introduce the 3 laws of in-universe Ghost Trap functionality. So while I was doing research for this video, I ended up creating a somewhat small list of defining features that were so absolutely necessary that they needed to be included in my final theory for continuity's sake. I'm going to go ahead and list them now before I get any further, so you guys can understand my thought process through some of the hardware inclusions I've made, as well as some of the explanations I'm about to give. So trap law number 1 is the ghost trap must produce radiation. Now this one seems like a no-brainer based on what I just said about the Frozen Empire schematics and OneTime's forum post, but I feel the need to emphasize this anyway, as almost every other theory I've read doesn't mention radiation at all. In fact, the only 2 trap explanations I've found that include radiation other than OneTime's forum post uses this post as a direct reference. Most other theories that floated around before OneTime connected the NRADS label to net radiation dose absorption per second involved the trap using some form of lasers, torque pressure, or some ill-defined burst of energy to suck in and store the ghost. Ultimately, the main reason why radiation is considered a non-negotiable for me is because my primary source of the Frozen Empire schematics includes a ton of OneTime's post in its text, almost verbatim, directly including the ideas on NRADS and ionizing radiation. Because these props were used in a mainline canon film, I believe it's the most credible explanation for the cone of energy that we currently have. Moving on to law number 2, the ghost trap must include muons in its operation. Now I kind of mentioned muons in this video already, as I've stated that OneTime's post is titled Muon Trap Operating Manual, but I haven't yet explained why he calls it a muon trap and what a muon even is, so let me explain. A muon is an elementary particle, or a particle that isn't made up of other particles, that's only created as a result of a high-energy particle collision. I'll get more detailed later as I bring them up, but you're probably questioning what that has to do with Ghostbusters at all. Basically, back in the great year of 2009, Ghostbusters the video game was released worldwide, and among other things, it introduced an alternative name for the ghost trap, the Muon Trap.
But a muon trap of this capacity has never been used or even tried before.
And although the video game isn't technically a part of the primary canon, at the time it was seen as a spiritual successor for the first 2 films, as the game has writing credits from Dan Aykroyd and Harold Ramis, as well as the entire main cast returning to voice their characters. Ever since this release, the term Muon Trap has taken root in the fan community and even made its way into the primary canon, with this mention in the Frozen Empire schematics. Unfortunately, it's never made clear exactly how the muons are used within the trap, so many explanations of the trap's function post-2009 have varied interpretations of where they fit in that you'll probably be familiar with soon.
Ray, prepare the muon trap.
Switching on the Muon Trap.
Now last, but arguably the most important law, the ghost trap has to function on its own. This one seems relatively self-explanatory at first, but I promise it's wildly important. I've seen a few theories really play into the idea of the trap and the proton pack working in tandem with each other. For example, Channeling Spirits video on the topic focuses a lot on the proton stream creating muons that are responsible for bringing the ghost down into the trap. Another example of this is Ghostbusters the video game, requiring you to weaken a ghost with the proton stream before it can be wrangled and subsequently trapped.
It indicates the current accumulation of a ghost's PKE. The more you disperse, the weaker it becomes.
This is a really cool concept, don't get me wrong, but relying on the proton pack for the trap to work breaks a lot of the established continuity with what we've seen both in the mainline films and most of the extended media of the franchise. The biggest example of this is the jogger ghost capture scene in Ghostbusters 2, where Peter and Ray trap a repeater by simply opening a trap as he runs over it. This is really all the canon evidence I need to prove that the ghost trap needs to be independent, but it's also worth noting that some other examples across different media, like when Winston captures Mama Scaleri outside of the courthouse with just a trap in the IDW comics, or how a well-placed trap throw is all that's needed to catch a ghost in Ghostbusters Spirits Unleashed. And that just about covers everything I needed you guys to know before we dive headfirst into what you came here for. So let's get right into it. Alright, so I'm actually going to break the explanation down into a few separate parts to keep my ideas from jumbling up into an incoherent mess of pseudoscientific ramblings. So we'll start out with explaining the outside of the trap, including the external electronic components, switches, lights, connections, and materials. After that, I'll dive into what's happening on the inside of the box, and I'll explain what all the knobs and dials on the outside do last, as the mechanisms of the inside of the trap will have to be explained first to understand what's going on with those. So let's jump right into the answer of our first question. What is the trap made out of? The easy answer for this one is aluminum, as that was the main material used for most of the hero trap props in the original films based on what I could find online. I think it's worth mentioning that aluminum is a fan favorite material for the metal accents in the prop building community too. As far as lore goes, the trap isn't mentioned directly a whole lot in any of the mainline films, as I'd mentioned before, so basic information like what metal it's made out of isn't clearly answered. Aluminum seems to be a sound choice though, as it's relatively lightweight, readily accessible, and fairly cheap. It's also mentioned in the Ectomobile Workshop manual that the trap is a rectangular chamber composed of an aluminum-like material on page 50, so I think it's safe to go with aluminum as the main material used making up the trap. The side plates which house the accessories on the outside, however, have been referred to as both aluminum and steel reinforcement plates from different sources. For example, you can see here in the blueprints on the back inside cover of the comic book Ghostbusters Mass Hysteria Volume 2 that the side plates are labeled as aluminum, whereas we can see here in the official Ghostbusters training manual tie-in children's book from 1984 labels these plates as steel reinforcement plates. I personally prefer the idea of having the plates made of steel or a similar material, as it's more atomically dense than aluminum and could provide for some additional protection against the radiation coming from within the trap, hence the reinforcement part. This is all but confirmed in the later films and merchandise that depict the side plates of the now aged traps as rusting, something that, unlike steel, aluminum does not do.
I'm seeing some rust stuff that looks really spectacular, but go ahead.
I was going to point that out.
Oh, yeah, point out
I'm glad you brought up rust.
Man.
Remaining on the topic of materials, I'd like to bring some attention to something that might sound a little mundane, but actually plays a pretty significant role in the operation of the trap: the paint job. While reading through the Ectomobile Workshop manual, I came across a pretty interesting claim that I hadn't seen anywhere else before on page 46. The book claims that the trap is coated with MOS2, which is described as a radiation-resistant film. MOS2 is the shortened version of
molybdenum disulfide,
which I'm not confident enough to pronounce, so I'll let an AI voice do that for me. Upon some further research, I discovered that
molybdenum disulfide
is not only a real thing, but it does have some radiation-resistant properties that can coat the surface of objects as described in the book. The book itself doesn't go into specifics on the so-called radiation-resistant properties of MOS2, but from the articles I've read, it seems to possess a strong surface absorption capacity and high surface area, which could help with the radiation absorption it has alluded to in the book. The dark grayish black appearance of MOS2 when coated on a surface implies that the parts of the ghost trap that are black aren't actually painted, but instead coated with MOS2. I think this implication is pretty cool and adds an extra layer of radiation resistance to the overall composition of the trap. However, several sources I've found describe MOS2 as slippery, since it's used commonly as a dry lubricant, as Fake Venkman points out in the book as well. It's a nice little detail that I haven't seen elsewhere, and I'd say it's a great addition to this theory, but with that being said, if the whole ghost trap was weirdly slippery to the touch, that obviously wouldn't be ideal. Also worth noting, while the Ectomobile Owner's Workshop manual is officially licensed by Ghost Corps, it's also outdated by the films and media that have come out since its release, and the concepts held within can be taken with a grain of salt. Feel free to let me know what you guys think about the inclusion of
molybdenum disulfide
in the comments as well. Sticking to the outside of the trap, I'll go over some of the external electronics now too. Over on the right side, there's a panel with an adjustable knob, which we'll talk about later, and a weird piece that looks like this. This rib panel is referred to directly as the electromagnetic heatsink in the Frozen Empire schematics we see here, and has been generally accepted as the trap's heatsink from what I found in discussions online dating back several years, probably because it looks exactly like an aluminum heatsink. It also sometimes is referred to as a vector plate. I'm assuming since the manufacturer of this specific piece is Vector Electronics. For those unfamiliar with what a heatsink is, it's basically a metal piece that's built in a way to absorb excess heat that's generated from electronics and disperses it throughout its surface area so that the temperature of the electronic device can stay regulated. On top of the heatsink panel, you can see this little copper-looking box. This is actually a resistor identified as a Cal-R MC250 resistor. A resistor's job is to basically limit current and dissipate power within an electrical circuit, and as it does this, it generates a bit of heat, which is then spread throughout the heatsink that it's right on top of. This is all pretty cool stuff, but I also think it's worth mentioning that I'm not an electrician, and I have no idea if the placement of this stuff on the outside panel here is necessarily a good idea or not, but it definitely looks pretty sick, and that's all that really matters. Moving on to the left side, we have a really cool teardrop-shaped dial that, again, I will definitely get into later, as well as these two red rods. From my understanding, these are referred to as ion rods, as you can see an example of in this article by Ghostbusters News. However, I've also seen them referred to as side rods, sidebars, and side tubes. Now, these rods are undoubtedly one of the most iconic parts of the Ghost Trap. So iconic, in fact, that I drew them on the wrong side of one of my visuals on accident. Anyway, as some of you actually watching this video instead of listening to it might have noticed, the title for this section is Materials, Mechanics, and Mysteries. Well, this is the mystery, actually. I'm pretty sad to say I genuinely have no idea what these two red rods are even supposed to do. And apparently nobody else does either. It's not mentioned in any of the movies, or books, videos, games, or any forum posts I've been able to come across at all. Almost all talk of these rods are just dimensions and suggestions for how to fabricate these for a prop project. Literally, both the Frozen Empire schematics and the Owner's Workshop manual book have pictures of the Ghost Trap filled with labels showing the side the red rods are on, and they just aren't even pointed out somehow. If I was to guess what these were for, I'd assume they were maybe some sort of backup power source, either by housing or being actual batteries that kick in if the main battery were to ever run out of juice. I've had a hard time trying to connect the name Ion Rod with a purpose for these things. I'm also assuming the color differences between the movies and scenes is just an aesthetic thing. I'm guessing the paint on these had one too many scratches on them at some point, so they decided to get rid of the paint entirely sometime before the events of Ghostbusters 2. It's all speculation at this point though, so don't get too mad if you have a different theory. I'd actually love to hear any suggestions you guys have on the function of these ion rods in the comments. One of you guys might actually have the answer for me too, and it could have been right underneath my nose this entire time. I was, however, able to find just one piece of information regarding the in-universe function of these ion rods via a Reddit post by user Bot Spooderman discussing how the rods in this shot of the first movie's montage are yellow. One of the comments by user Hidden Holding suggests that the yellow rods are specifically for catching mustard ghosts, which clears up a lot of unanswered questions, honestly. Following this thought process, I think it's safe to say that Slimer is a ketchup ghost and the Scoleri brothers are canonically mayonnaise ghosts. And with that out of the way, let's move on to the front of the trap. So the front panel has 4 incredibly important knobs and dials I will get into later, I promise. But above these, we have the valence indicator, sometimes referred to as the integrity meter, PKE monitor, and several other names. This bar graph display at the top of the trap has a couple different interpretations on what it's actually reading. For starters, OneTime's trap manual states that the bar graph primarily indicates the PKE storage level of the trap. This seems to match up pretty well with what we see in the films, noticeably when they trap Slimer in the Sedgwick. You can see here that the bar graph lights up immediately after Slimer enters the trap, and it stays on for the entire time that we see the trap after his capture. OneTime elaborates a little further throughout the manual on the purpose of this display too, saying that the bar graph will light up to signal different preset selections and indicate if the trap is synced with the removable tray. Most of the Ghostbusters NorthWest video agrees with this as well, as their interpretation is mostly a retelling of OneTime's post. The Channeling Spirits video only briefly mentions the valence indicator, but notably brings up that the term valence indicator was used to refer to the bar graph display in an early draft of the script, lending credence to the term being the official name for the display. I personally don't think that's the best name for it though, considering most sources agree that it primarily detects if the ghost is in the trap and how much space it takes up, and it isn't measuring anything else like valency of the atoms inside the trap. Regardless, we'll revisit this later as I explain what the knobs and dials do, as I alluded to earlier. With that out of the way, we can dive into probably the most complex part of the trap, the back. There's a lot going on at the back of the trap, so let me break it down for you. This trapezoidal shape in the back here is most likely where the main rechargeable battery that powers the trap resides. This space in between the battery pack and the inner cartridge is most likely reserved for the bulk of the electronics in the trap, including circuit boards, speakers, and the motors responsible for opening and closing the trap's doors. Here's a cool idea of what the inside space might look like as illustrated by Ian Moores in the Ectomobile Workshop manual. Above this space are 3 pretty important parts of the trap: the handle, the activation switch, and the occupation indicator light. I'll go ahead and start off with the occupation indicator, since it works in tandem with the valence indicator, and I just covered that. So I'm sure most of you are familiar with this blinking red light. It's pretty iconic, and you know that it blinks to indicate that an entity has successfully been contained within the trap. The valence indicator performs a somewhat similar function, but its primary focus is to display how full the trap is based on the maximum capacity via the bar graph. All the occupation indicator does is signal if a ghost is in the box. Both the valence and the occupation indicators play a sound when lit up, up, which most likely comes from a small speaker in the aforementioned space underneath the handle. I think it's also worth mentioning that the occupation indicator is sometimes shown to be a solid red light in several scenes, most notably right after the entrapment of Slimer is seen here. This also appears to be the case in several of the montage scenes as well. I would say that the indicator light stops flashing shortly after the ghost is trapped, but stays on to signal that the ghost is still there. But we can see here, when Ray hands the newly hired Winston 2 traps after the job, the indicator lights are still flashing even after all the time that's passed between the entrapment of those ghosts and getting back to the firehouse. Same goes for the trap that's holding Vince Clortho in the opening scene of Afterlife. Just know that if the red light is on, flashing or not, a ghost is in the trap. Right next to the occupation indicator is the activation switch. Both OneTime and subsequently Ghostbusters NorthWest describe the activation switch as a toggle for providing power to the trap's main housing, or the trap tray. This switch does not immediately provide power to the inner cartridge, as this switch in the front is set to off by default. Once this front panel switch is moved to any other position, power will be allowed to flow into the inner cartridge. I know that you're tired of me saying this by now, but I promise I'll elaborate more on that later. That being said, the activation switch works a lot like a safety to prevent the trap from being opened unintentionally, especially as the Ghostbusters move around with the pedal on their belt. And lastly, we have the handle. Other than the obvious use of allowing the operator to carry the trap and roll it out like a curling stone, I want to point your attention to this tiny little button at the top. It actually isn't a button, but a sliding switch, which is used to release the inner cartridge from the trap tray when depositing an entity into the containment unit. Speaking of which, I'd also like to take this time to point out this connector port on the back of the inner canister. I don't think I've seen anyone else remark on this small detail before, but this part seems to specifically be a DA-15 connector, as it has 8 pins in the top row and 7 pins below. This port looks to be the main connection between the inner cartridge and the electronics in the trap tray, explaining how adjustments made via the dials on the outer tray can affect the electronics of the inner cartridge despite them being removable. I'd like to point out that this port is noticeably absent in Frozen Empire, as we can see the back of the inner cartridge pretty clearly as Gary unloads the sewer dragon into the containment unit, and this port is nowhere to be found. This could be a missing detail that was overlooked by the prop department, or it could indicate that the electronics within the traps have been upgraded over time to include some type of modern technology like Bluetooth or something similar. And now moving on, last but not least, I'll take some time to go over the foot pedal. The foot pedal is actually pretty basic in its operation, and it's consistent throughout most iterations of the franchise. Basically, as long as the trap's activation switch is turned on, stopping the pedal once will open the trap's doors and deploy the currently mysterious cone of energy. A second pedal stomp will subsequently close the trap doors once the entity has been successfully pulled inside. That's it. Pretty simple stuff. I think it's worth noting that in Ghostbusters 2, Egon has his foot on the pedal the entire time and releases it to close the trap doors. However, in Ghostbusters 1, which is what I'm going to be mostly focusing on, Ray hits the pedal once and then a second time separately to activate the closing sequence. As far as the electronics go, none of it is really super integral for fully understanding the trap's operation. All that needs to be known is that the pedal sends an electric signal to the trap via the cable with each stomp, which then results in a desired action to happen. For the hell of it though, I'll point out some of the specific parts and tell you exactly what they are. This fancy looking square light bulb at the top of the pedal is an ITT RM833212 11 pin relay system. Fun fact, this relay was actually moved down to the side of the box parallel with the pedal in Ghostbusters Afterlife. It's generally assumed that this change was made to give more foot clearance when stomping the pedal. Next up, the connection between the pedal and the trap uses Foster Quick Connect fittings. The male ends on both the pedal and the trap are specifically 22-2B Foster male couplers and are connected to each other via the female connections on the end of each cable. The cable is generally accepted to be 3 to 5 meters in length. Its grooved metal plate on the pedal itself is also referred to as a vector plate by the community, as this part is also manufactured by Vector Electronics, just like the plate used for the heatsink on the side of the trap. If we want to get real specific, the part used for both the pedal and the heatsink is an SR2-97A2-S aluminum rail frame, just cut down at different lengths to fit the need for each part. Shout out to GBFans forum user Dr. James House for making the post that brought this to my attention. Now, the pedal actually has its own full prop schematic page like the trap does as well. I've only been able to find this one image of it on Ghostbusters reference library, so I apologize for the extremely poor quality. The page seems to be mainly a continuation of the trap's page, as most of the writing on it consists of details for the dial settings at the front of the trap. While we're here though, I want to take the time to point out the continuity error I mentioned earlier when referencing these schematic props. So as you can see right here in a crisp 480p, this note reads, once activated, the trap engages a fixed, powerful, positive electromagnet. This pulls the manifestation inside, which is an almost exact quote from the Channeling Spirits video. The problem with this is that a positively charged electromagnet can't be responsible for pulling in a ghost with what's already been established. I think they just pulled this from the Channeling Spirits video without giving it much thought, which is fair, considering no one was meant to study these set dressing props like I currently am. I am going to take the time though to go on this tangent to explain why this can't work with what we know now, as I believe it lays the groundwork for what I'll be talking about soon when I answer exactly how the trap pulls in and traps a ghost. So the reason this can't work is relatively simple to understand. As I've stated with my first established law earlier in this video, ionizing radiation has to come out of the trap. Within the context of the schematic props I'm working with, this is especially true as the ionizing radiation cone is directly mentioned multiple times. The trap page also directly establishes the ghost being made up of negatively charged ions. Now you're probably thinking, well, this makes perfect sense. The positive magnet will attract the negative ghost into the trap. And while yes, this does make sense on the surface, the introduction of the ionizing radiation complicates this process by quite a bit. So for those of you who don't know, ionizing radiation is essentially radiation that carries enough energy to potentially strip the electrons off of an atom. The act of stripping these electrons out of orbit is ionization. An ion is an atom that carries a charge, either by the addition or removal of an electron. Most atoms that exist naturally have no charge, as they are made up of a balanced number of positively charged protons and negatively charged electrons. Each proton and electron carries one charge, positive and negative respectively. So if there are 8 protons and 8 electrons in, let's say, an oxygen atom, the 8 positive charges and 8 negative charges cancel each other out, making the overall charge of an atom neutral. If I were to introduce some pesky ionizing radiation that happened to strip one of the oxygen's electrons from orbit, the oxygen would now be considered a positively charged ion, as it would now have more protons than electrons, with that extra proton giving the atom an overall positive charge. Now using that logic, if it's established that a ghost is made out of negatively charged ions, and it's also established that ionizing radiation will be hitting the ghost as a core component of the trap's operation, then we can conclude that the ghost's ions will end up either neutral or positively charged depending on how powerful the radiation is. If we stick with the oxygen for continuity here, a negatively charged oxygen ion will likely have 2 extra electrons, but we'll say it has just 1 extra electron here that's been purposefully introduced by psychokinetic energy to form a ghost for our specific situation. If the ghost happens to be made out of this hypothetically negatively charged oxygen, or really any element with an extra electron, the ionizing radiation will strip the extra electron in most, if not all, of the atoms that make up the ghost, therefore returning the atoms back to their balanced and neutral state. If the radiation is powerful enough, it also has the potential to remove multiple electrons from orbit. If that were to happen in this case, then the resulting atom would have more protons than electrons and would be positively charged. With the introduction of the ionizing radiation cone, the only outcomes would result in the ghost that's established as negatively charged becoming positively charged or neutral. And if that's the case, then a positively charged electromagnet would either do nothing or end up repelling the ghost away from the trap. But the real kicker is, I just did all that research to prove that a positive electromagnet can't pull the ghost in, and I only just recently discovered that a magnetic force alone can't initiate motion in an ion. Turns out a magnetic field basically just guides an ion along a path, and an electric field is actually needed to initiate movement in an ion. This is a gross oversimplification, but the point is that just an electromagnet producing a magnetic field, regardless of the charge, wouldn't be able to pull a cloud of ions into the trap on its own. And for that to happen, we'd have to introduce electric fields, and we'll definitely be getting into that in detail later. Anyway, moral of the story is whatever is pulling the ghost into the trap has to be negatively charged because the ionizing radiation coming from the trap pretty much has to ionize the ghost's atoms into positively charged ions, or else there's no point in the radiation even entering the equation at all, but it very much has already. Glad we're all on the same page. All that said and done, I think that just about covers the entire outside of the trap, with the exception of the wheels at the bottom, which is pretty self-explanatory.
Flowers are still standing.
So let's go ahead and get into the meat of the trap and explore what's going on inside of the box. Alright, so let's get straight into it. The moment we've all been waiting for, and the question that you probably want answered after the tangent I just went on. What produces the ionizing radiation? What type of radiation is it? And what role does it play in the trapping of the ghosts? Well, let's start off with the why first. As I had mentioned before, the idea of radiation being produced from the trap, I believe, was a recently introduced concept that was popularized by GBFans forum user OneTime. I am a human though, and I very well could have overlooked some previous discussions on radiation that could have inspired OneTime's post. Regardless, the idea has been spread pretty thoroughly now and has been used in popular videos and discussions on the topic, as well as its most notable inclusion in the Frozen Empire props I keep mentioning. It's also worth bringing up that the seeds for ionization being a huge part of the Ghostbusters tech was planted as early as this scene from the first movie.
If the ionization rate is constant for all ectoplasmic entities, we could really bust some heads.
So now that we know why the radiation has to exist, what specific type of radiation is it? Well, thankfully OneTime's forum post goes into great detail regarding the exact type of radiation used in this interpretation of the trap's function. According to OneTime, the trap uses ionizing radiation via muonic decay. I'll get into more detail as what that means in a second, but I'd like to go ahead and mention that I personally think this is the coolest integration of muons that I've seen to date. It makes a lot of sense within his explanation, and I think it's one of the more creative ways that I've seen muons used in the explanation of the trap. I'll read a portion of this post now to establish this idea. OneTime states, the Muon Trap works by creating a field of ionizing radiation by muon decay inside a cone-shaped area enforced by hollow laser beams. The conic field is subsequently enclosed, decreased in size, and steered into the shielding area of the cartridge. Now, OneTime seems rather confident in his theory based on what I found when looking around the forums. This comment from 2020 in particular is essentially correcting someone on the light color inside of their trap build based on his own ideas. While I admire the confidence, and this theory is still very cool conceptually, I believe there's several flaws in his logic that made me decide against using this approach for incorporating muons in the explanation of the radiation cone. Let me break down a few of these issues so I can further explain the reasoning for my own explanation that I'll be implementing soon. I do promise this is meant to be productive and isn't meant to belittle OneTime's logic. He just happens to provide a great starting point in the explanation for my train of thought, especially with his ideas being so well embedded in the modern trap theory. For starters, I've done some research on the lasers, and I think that he included them here as a science fiction-y way to explain how the muon decay radiation was produced into a conic shape. I think the specific term of hollow lasers came from their mention in the 2016 reboot film as an explanation for Gillian Holtzman's gadgets. A hollow beam is mentioned in this specific clip.
The reversible psychokinetic energy sink plus Holtz's hollow beam to this baby, and voila.
And we can actually see the lasers they're probably referring to in the trap image itself. Now, I'm not entirely sure if this is where OneTime was introduced to the concept, but I believe this is where the term hollow beam and/or hollow laser really entered the picture of Ghostbusters conversations. It's also worth noting that this film came out in 2016, and OneTime's post was created in 2018. Regardless, as far as my research on the topic shows, lasers and hollow lasers don't actually have the capacity to interact with other radiation at all. The closest application of that idea in the real world that I could find was the use of lasers to guide the operators of radiation-producing equipment when performing medical procedures or something similar, as radiation is invisible to the naked eye. A laser has no way of interacting with radiation at all and can't steer anything on its own. Secondly, he uses the radiation as a catch-all explanation here for the reasoning behind pulling the ghost into the trap, as well as an explanation for what keeps the ghost in. Ionizing radiation, regardless of the type, is really only capable of ionizing the particles of a ghost and not much else, hence the name. So most of this theory derails a bit if you look into the details of what the radiation is actually responsible for here. Lastly, while muonic decay radiation is objectively cool and a very fitting way to insert muons into the equation, I'd have to say that using this type of radiation is fundamentally impossible in the Ghostbusters universe. Now, I know that's a bold claim, so let me explain. So let's break this down real quick. Ionizing radiation via muon decay is obviously created when a muon decays. As I've mentioned previously, a muon is an elementary particle that's created as the result of a high-energy particle collision. More specifically, when a high-energy particle collision happens, an elementary particle called a pion is produced, among others, as a result of that reaction. That pion then decays quite quickly, like within 20-ish nanoseconds, into a muon, as well as some other less important particles. Similarly, the muon then decays itself, a little slower this time, around 2 microseconds later. The muon can then potentially decay into an array of different combinations of electrons, neutrinos, photons, and electron-positron pairs. The most common form of muon decay is called a 3-body decay, which produces an electron and 2 neutrinos. But what matters the most here is the electron, as neutrinos do not cause ionization due to their neutral charge and their extremely low chance of interacting with matter. The general idea is once a muon decays, it will most likely release an electron that carries enough energy to ionize the molecules that will make up the ghost. While this theory is really solid, there's unfortunately one major flaw that, in my opinion, makes the use of muon decay from within the trap impossible: the particle accelerator. As I mentioned before, muons are the product of high-energy particle collisions. These collisions only really happen in nature when cosmic rays collide with the particles in our atmosphere, otherwise they're created by particle accelerators in labs. Alright, it's me here from the future, currently editing the video, back in my recording studio, aka my closet. So apologies if I sound different here, but I made some new discoveries that I feel warranted a re-recording of this next part. So my initial argument was that making a particle accelerator small enough to fit in the trap, specifically to create muons, wouldn't make much sense in the world of Ghostbusters. So I initially thought that the cyclotron on the Proton pack, here, was science-fictionally small at the time. But after doing some basic research, I discovered that the first ever cyclotron made in the 1930s was only 4.5 inches in diameter, which is like half the size of the one on the Proton pack. So I did some more digging and discovered the relationship between spatial capacity and the particle acceleration in cyclotrons, and I'll be using that information to prove my point now. So from what I've been able to find out, as a particle's energy is increased in a cyclotron, the radius at which it travels expands. This essentially means that the physical size of the cyclotron needs to be bigger if you want to accelerate particles to higher energies. In theory, a synchrotron is the answer to this problem, as they employ stronger magnetic fields that adjust to the speed of the particle to create a fixed radius. But the superconducting magnets and other equipment needed to make a synchrotron work make even the smallest ones fill up an entire room. A cyclotron, however, could, in theory, be made small enough to fit into the ghost trap, but a cyclotron of that size could not produce a particle collision with enough energy to create a pion. At this point, I'm definitely way too far in over my head here, but just try to bear with me. From what I could find online, somewhere in the ballpark of 280 to 300 MeV, or mega electron volts, is the kinetic energy a particle would need in order to create a collision resulting in a pion. Just for an example of this technology at the time, we can see here in this proposed cyclotron design for Michigan State University in 1972 that an average radius of 56.4 inches produces a particle with an energy around 200 MeV, which is obviously way bigger than what we could fit in the ghost trap and doesn't even meet the energy requirements for pion production. This all isn't even accounting for magnets or the power consumption or collision target or, above all else, a consistent source of charged particles to accelerate that would be required for a cyclotron like this to work properly. Bottom line is, if I'm understanding everything correctly here, putting a cyclotron with a 3-inch minimum diameter into the ghost trap to consistently fire particles at a target with energies exceeding 280 mega electron volts to create a constant stream of pions decaying into muons just to achieve ionizing radiation is a huge stretch, even by science fiction standards. And with all that being said, I'd like to introduce a comparatively simple source of ionizing radiation that easily fits the space and power restrictions of the trap's design, as well as the required energy output to ionize a ghost's ions. X-rays are an ideal candidate for our use of ionizing radiation, mainly due to how they are produced. X-rays can be produced manually through an X-ray tube, also known as an X-ray anode. Simply put, X-rays are created when an electric current is applied to a filament within said tube. The filament then releases electrons due to being heated up by the current. These electrons are then attracted to a positive anode, and when they collide with the anode, produce X-ray photons. This whole process occurs within the tiny X-ray tube and only requires the introduction of electricity to work, unlike muon decay and other forms of ionizing radiation like alpha and beta particles and gamma rays. These other forms of radiation usually require an unsafe sample of radioactive material, particle accelerators, or other means that are too impractical to be produced for our specific situation. This, to me, all but confirms that X-rays are the main contender for an explanation behind the ionizing radiation being emitted from the trap, mainly due to the size, simplicity, and accessibility of their origin point. Considering that the first X-ray tube was invented in 1895 and its widespread medical use dates back to all the way in the early 1900s, it's well within reason that the Ghostbusters were aware of this technology in the 80s and would use it as a reliable source of ionizing radiation for the traps. So now that we know what type of radiation we're using, what's the point and how does it affect the ghosts? Well, in order to answer that, we have to tackle another important topic first. What exactly is a ghost in the Ghostbusters universe?
A full dorsal apparition, and it's real.
Now, I hopefully won't take too long on this, but it's important to know a couple things about the ghosts within this universe to understand the significance of the X-rays and other functions of the trap that we haven't quite gotten to yet. I'll probably make an entire video on this later, but for right now, here's what we need to know. Many aspects of the ghost in the Ghostbusters universe remain unknown. However, what we do know is relatively limited to the fact that they're always negatively charged and can be categorized by a class system that's alluded to throughout the films.
Or a Class 5 full roaming vapor. Real nasty one, too.
For example, some ghosts have more animalistic tendencies and form as a result of emotionally charged events, while some others are distinctly human and seem to retain memories from their past life. Now, the exact science and reasoning behind the existence of the spirit world and the consciousness behind the manifestations of ghosts remains mostly unknown in the primary canon. But what's really important here is exactly what the ghosts use in our world to manifest into an entity. Realistically, the Ghostbusters don't actually have to understand the reasoning behind what most of the ghosts do and how they get into our world. The only thing they need to know is what a ghost is made out of once they get into our dimensional plane. I guarantee if you sat down Egon Spengler right now and asked him to explain the science behind how Gozer shoots lightning out of their fingers, or how ancient Central Asian warriors canonically sealed a horned ice giant into a brass ball with firebending, he probably wouldn't be able to tell you. But the confirmed existence of the paranormal in this universe comes with all sorts of unknowns that are beyond our comprehension and probably will remain that way forever. I feel like this is why Lars makes this comment in Frozen Empire.
How's that possible?
It's an ancient god from another dimension. He used to know its atomic composition.
And according to the Channeling Spirits video, why Ray decides to leave his trap behind when facing Gozer, as it's clear that they're on a whole different level than the run-of-the-mill ion clouds that the Ghostbusters have been used to dealing with thus far. This was later proven wrong in Afterlife, but that's besides the point. One of these unknowns seems pretty important for the specific application of X-rays though, so let's dive into that for a second. In Ghostbusters 2, positive and negative energy is a huge plot point for the film, which is now known to be canon, with Vigo the Carpathian's power being amplified by psychomagnetheric Slime's reaction to the negative energy in New York City. This, along with the eventual defeat of Vigo using a high concentration of positive vibes.
Sorry, he's weakening! The singing is neutralizing the slime!
Heavily suggests a strong relationship between the concept of positivity and negativity as definitions for both human emotions and electromagnetic charges in the Ghostbusters universe. While this was evidently first discovered in Ghostbusters 2, the concept was most likely discovered to a lesser extent when Egon was drafting the function for the ghost trap, as it was probably inferred that there was a huge significance in the fact that ghosts only chose to manifest using negatively charged ions.
What are you working on, Egon?
Trying to determine whether human emotions actually affect the physical environment. It's a theory Ray and I had when we were still Ghostbusters.
Therefore, one can assume that if the ghost's ions were forcibly changed into a positive state via the removal of its extra electrons, the ghost would potentially become weaker in some way that might be outside of our current understanding. Enter ionizing radiation. As I ranted about before, the existence of ionizing radiation can only result in the cloud of negative ions that makes up a ghost becoming either neutral or positive, nothing else. After everything I just laid out, it's almost a guarantee here that the X-ray's job is to make the ghost positively charged, most likely to kick the entity out of its comfort zone in hopes of weakening it somehow. So as I mentioned before, the exact makeup of the ghosts is never defined, and we only really know that they're negatively charged ions. I haven't seen a whole lot of theorizing on the topic, although I feel like I might have missed some discussion about it online somewhere. That being said, I am a pretty big fan of Channeling Spirits' explanation of the ghost's makeup, as it aligns really well with my theory and what I've established so far. It's also featured in probably the most popular video on YouTube that's discussing Ghostbusters lore at the moment, so that gives it some credibility too. In their video on the breakdown of the Proton pack, they use negatively charged hydrogen ions as an explanation for the ghost makeup. More specifically, they describe that the unexplained PKE energy pulls valence electrons from the environment and combines them with hydrogen atoms. This results in a negatively charged hydrogen ion consisting of a proton and 2 electrons. The pKe energy responsible for creating the ion also works as a binding force between these hydrogen ions as they form, eventually leading to the formation of a ghost. They don't go into much further detail, but I do really love the idea of using hydrogen due to its atomic simplicity and the abundance of it in the air of public spaces in the form of water vapor. I'm assuming if the pKe energy can pull random electrons from the environment, then it can also be responsible for separating hydrogen from oxygen in water molecules. Using a specific example like hydrogen also allows me to give you an idea of exactly how much energy would be needed to change one of these ghosts into a positive state, so I'll be using it moving forward as my primary example. Alright, so back to the X-rays. Now we know why, but exactly how do the X-rays get rid of the electrons in a ghost? Well, simply put, an X-ray tube will exist within the trap, taking up about half of the available real estate within the inner cartridge. The specific model I have in mind is a D-0813SB stationary anode, which, if I'm interpreting this information correctly, is about 72 millimeters long, or about 2.83 inches for my fellow Americans. Now, I'm having a hard time finding out when this exact model of X-ray tube was made, but I found that the producer, Toshiba, has been making tubes since 1915, so I think it's reasonable to assume that a tube of roughly this size and caliber was around sometime in the early 80s. If not, then I guess we can use science fiction as an excuse for a slightly smaller or slightly more powerful X-ray tube than what the current time allowed for. I chose this specific model mostly because of its size, its energy output, and its lead casing, which is another layer of added radiation protection for the user, as well as electromagnetic interference protection for all the electronics within the trap. Now, considering I don't have a scale replica of the trap for myself, I'm instead using these incredibly detailed prop building plans by Sean Bishop for accurate measurements. I highly recommend checking out these plans if you haven't seen them already. The detail is insane and it's super helpful for making a prop yourself. So based on these plans, I can assume that we're working with about 7.31 inches for the length of the inner cartridge, leaving plenty of room for my other planned uses for this space. The tube also appears to be 42 millimeters or 1.65 inches wide, which is plenty small enough to fit within the 3.31 inch width of the trap. Now for the height, I'm definitely not smart enough to interpret exactly what this is trying to tell me, but I'm going to assume that the end of the tube is a perfect circle and that the previously discussed width of 42 millimeters is the diameter, which would also mean that the height is the same. This 1.65 inch height checks out with the available height for the trap, which is around 2.63 inches. As for the power this thing can put out, I believe it's more than enough to completely obliterate the electrons we're working with here. According to the tube schematics I've been working with, the nominal X-ray tube voltage is 80 kilovolts. Since the maximum energy of the X-rays produced is directly related to the voltage applied, we can assume that this tube puts out X-rays with a maximum energy of about 80 kilo electron volts, or a whopping 80,000 electron volts.
Nothing stings like a billion electron volts!
This is way more than we really need to get rid of both of the electrons on our negatively charged hydrogen, since in order to do that, we would need around a measly 14 electron volts. As far as powering this goes, I've done some minimal research on batteries, since regardless of the nature of whatever we put into the trap, it kinda has no choice but to be powered by a battery that can fit in this small compartment in the back. There's really no clever workaround that'll explain the power supply if a battery can't work in the scenario, so we'd have to science fiction this if it can't work regardless. I did, however, find a battery type that could potentially run everything I need it to run within the trap. After some time, I found that a lithium-ion polymer battery would be the best bet for my current set of challenges. If you happen to be a battery expert watching this video, please let me know if there's a better option in the comments. Regardless, the first lithium-ion battery was developed in 1985, so the concept isn't too far into the realm of science fiction for our specific purposes. Using this Tenergy brand battery I found online as a baseline, we can see that it exists within slightly outside of the space constraints presented by the battery compartment at the back of the trap. According to Sean Bishop's design plans I mentioned earlier, the trap compartment is 3.31 inches by 2.19 inches by 2.75 inches minus the corners, with the battery being 6.3 inches by 3.15 inches by 2.76 inches. The main problem here is the length, but in theory we could remove the battery's casing and configure the cells more compactly, or just science fiction it to be smaller. Regardless, using a lithium-ion polymer battery of the approximate size we're looking for, we can look at its power output to see if powering an X-ray tube with the battery is within the realm of possibility. As we can see from the tube schematics, the nominal anode input power is 1350 watts per second. Since the power output is the voltage times the current, this battery seems to be capable of producing 1632 watts of power. I also learned that if we divide the watt hours shown here by the watts I need to produce, we can get a time frame for how long this battery can produce 1350 watts for. If we do that math, we get about 0.32 hours, or 19.2 minutes, of continuous 1350 watt power from this battery before it dies. Considering we only ever see the ghost trap open and actively capturing an entity for a couple seconds at a time, this is more than enough power for what we need it to do if I did the math correctly. So now that we know that an X-ray tube can absolutely fit inside the ghost trap, provide enough energy to remove 2 or more electrons from orbit, can continuously produce X-rays for several minutes, and can realistically be powered by a battery, I think that it's just about checked off every requirement on my list. And now that we're confident in the reasoning and logistics behind the X-rays, let's move on ahead. So the next piece of equipment that'll share the inside of the trap with the X-ray tube will be responsible for sucking in and holding the ghost's ions within the trap, but it does not include muons in its operation. Shocking, I know. Since I made such a big deal about the trap including muons, and the X-rays don't involve muons and neither does this next part, then how do muons enter the picture? Well, that was the question on my mind for a couple of weeks after discovering that muon decay radiation would require a particle accelerator and couldn't be used in my specific situation. Fortunately, I think I found a very solid idea that combines 2 of the biggest fan theories I could find on the inclusion of muons. I will admit, though, that the way I include muons isn't as cool or impactful as being responsible for the radiation, but I believe my theory makes the most sense in context. So the inclusion of muons for my theory combines the best of 2 of the most prominent fan theories I just mentioned. The first is obviously OneTime's muon decay radiation, and the second is how Channeling Spirits video explains the inclusion of muons. In their video, they claim that the muons are produced via the collision between protons from the proton stream and the hydrogen ions that make up a ghost. This collision produces a pion, which decays into a muon, but instead of the muon decaying any further, it instead bonds with the hydrogen it just collided with to form muonic hydrogen, or essentially a hydrogen molecule with a muon in orbit instead of an electron. They go on to explain that when enough of these muonic hydrogens are formed, the ghost is subsequently weighed down into the trap due to the muons being roughly 200 times heavier than that of the electrons that used to take up the space. While this is also incredibly interesting and a creative theory, I can say with general confidence that this most likely wouldn't be the result of the proton collisions with the ghost. The main point that I think is worth noting is that gravity doesn't really affect subatomic particles with any significance at all. If the muons were to bond with the hydrogen like they claim to do in the video, the difference in weight of the particles would have virtually no effect on the ghost as a whole. Not to mention that with muonic hydrogen, while technically possible, it's extremely unstable and probably wouldn't last long enough to weigh the ghost down into the trap anyway. This line of thinking would also create a plot hole in Frozen Empire when the sewer dragon is pulled into the drone trap from below. I can give credit where it's due to Channeling Spirits though, as they do have a passing line in their video that mentions the pull of a powerful electromagnet that aids in the process as we've mentioned earlier. That being said, my muon inclusion theory essentially combines these 2 concepts into one. The general idea is when a Ghostbuster fires a proton stream at the ghost, an occasional proton will collide with the ghost's hydrogen ions as it's being wrangled. This high energy particle collision will result in the creation of a pion, and eventually a muon as we've discussed previously. Instead of bonding with the nearby hydrogen, however, the muon will instead take a more likely course of action and decay itself, creating the muon decay radiation featured in OneTime's post. This electron responsible for ionization will be released from the muon and collide with another hydrogen ion near it, and will have enough energy to remove both of the hydrogen's electrons from orbit. Rinse and repeat. Now, for those of you who are paying attention to my cyclotron rant from earlier, you might have noticed that I spent a lot of time proving that a cyclotron with a 56-inch diameter couldn't create a pion-inducing high-energy collision, let alone the 10-inch diameter one on the proton pack. However, I think it's worth taking that pseudoscientific liberty here, as the proton pack's whole gimmick is shooting out a stream of accelerated protons, whereas the inside of the ghost trap remains ambiguous throughout the franchise. Anyway, assuming that the proton pack can indeed create high-energy collisions, the more the proton stream is fired at the ghost, the more likely the particle collisions are to happen, thus more muon decay radiation being produced from within the ghost. This supporting radiation, as I like to call it, will happen as the Ghostbuster continues to hold the ghost within the proton stream, and will gradually weaken the ghost over time by slowly converting its negative ions into positive ions in a similar manner to what the X-rays will be doing, just on a smaller scale. This corroborates the concept of the proton stream weakening the ghost as we see in the extended media like Ghostbusters the video game as well. And while I love this idea and ultimately settled on it because of how sound I believe the logic is here, I do also understand that the muons in this situation are a lot more linked to the proton stream than the ghost trap itself. If we look at muons as they are, instead of a catch-all sci-fi term that seems to be causing everything from grabbing the ghost to locking it away once the trap doors are closed, it's a lot harder to implement them in the design. I'd love to hear everyone's theories on muons in the comments as well, but for now we're going to stick with them being used as supporting radiation, aiding in the removal of the ghost's electrons. So now that we have solid explanations for the ionizing radiation and the use of muons in the trapping process, that means we have but one vital question left to answer. How does the ghost trap actually trap the ghost? The wording of the schematics is a bit misleading, as I believe the penning trap is actually inside of the ghost trap as a component of its operation, as opposed to the entire ghost trap functioning as a big penning trap. But before I go any further and say the word trap for the 80 millionth time, let me break down exactly what a penning trap is for those who are unfamiliar. A penning trap is essentially the device used by particle physicists to trap charged ions in the real world. It specifically combines axial magnetic fields with quadrupole electric fields to confine charged particles within it for an extended period of time for study. And despite what you might be thinking, this technology isn't actually science fiction and has existed for quite some time. The device itself was named after Dutch physicist F.M. Penning, who introduced some essential concepts that led to the creation of the trap. The first penning trap was actually built by German physicist H.G. Demelt in the not-so-recent year of 1959. By the time 1984 rolls around, using a penning trap to capture and study ions is a common practice and would undoubtedly be on the radar of a certain group of fictional scientists at the time. As far as its use in the ghost trap, the penning trap idea has been floating around the community for quite possibly decades. Here's the oldest known mention that I could find in discussions online, dating back to 9 years ago by Reddit user DC Carrier, although I'm sure it's cropped up elsewhere in discussions that predate this comment as well. With the understanding that ghosts in the Ghostbusters universe are made up of charged ions, the idea of a real-world ion trap being discussed as an explanation comes as no surprise. In recent years, the penning trap idea was again popularized by Channeling Spirits' video on the trap's operation, as they state towards the end of the video that the trap functions as a variation of the penning trap when describing how the ghost is held within the trap's cavity after being pulled inside. As I've mentioned before, some of the ideas from this video were most likely used to form parts of the text on the Frozen Empire schematic props, most likely including this phrase, a penning trap for electromagnetically containing negatively charged ions, as seen at the top of the ghost trap's page. The inclusion of this mention in the schematic props all but confirms that the penning trap is the canon explanation for how the ghost trap actually captures a ghost. So let's get into how it does that. While researching penning traps, I found myself at a loss for the most basic information about them, as most every paper or article I could find was only focusing on specifics in the experiments that the material was discussing. Even the books and summary articles I found only generalized measurements like size, power usage, ion capacity, and so on. So after being stumped by trying to find basic information for several days, I performed the only logical next step in my quest for basic information on the penning trap. I directly emailed an accomplished particle physicist across the world asking if he could help me with my Ghostbusters YouTube video. And that's actually worked somehow. Yes, I actually consulted a real particle physicist for my stupid Ghostbusters lore video. And not just any old particle physicist either. I've been in contact with the Dr. Richard Thompson, a current professor of experimental physics at the Imperial College in London, boasting a PhD in atomic spectroscopy, a bachelor in physics, and notable previous positions such as the Vice Dean of Education for the Faculty of Natural Sciences at Imperial, a member of the SPS and PS Experiments Committee at CERN, a member of the Natural Sciences Panel, panel, and chair of the accreditation committee for the Institute of Physics, among many, many others. Not to mention he's been in the field longer than Ghostbusters has even existed, starting his career after graduating from Oxford in 1980. Dr. Thompson is, without a shadow of a doubt, the real deal, and after reading his credentials in detail to write this part of the video, I'm honestly surprised he even entertained my silly little questions at all. But for everyone watching this video, dreams do come true, trust me, just try it and I promise, and just throw spaghetti at the wall and something will stick. If you're watching this, Dr. Thompson, thank you again for everything. Anyway, now that I have one of the world's leading penning trap experts helping me out, let's talk logistics.
Let's talk seriously.
So starting with the basics, Dr. Thompson has informed me that a penning trap's operation can be broken down into 3 basic layers. The trap itself, which includes the electrodes responsible for the electric fields, exists within a vacuum can, and said vacuum can exists within a magnet. The vacuum is responsible for keeping out any unwanted particles, and the magnet obviously produces the aforementioned magnetic field. One of the first questions I asked Dr. Thompson was how large is a standard penning trap, so I can see if a functioning penning trap could realistically exist within the space constraints of the Ghost Trap prop. Turns out, Dr. Thompson actually attempted a portable penning trap in the past, and has some first-hand experience with the space limitations of such a system. From what he's described to me, the actual trap cylinder itself is absolutely able to fit within the Ghost Trap's cavity, and can really be as small as I need it to be. Here's an image of a cylindrical electrode trap he worked on in the past with an outside diameter of about 30 millimeters, or about 1.18 inches. He didn't give me a direct length of this trap, but based on the diameter compared to the length, I'm assuming this is probably about 1.5 to 2 end caps long, roughly within the ballpark of 45 to 60 millimeters, or between 1.77 and 2.36 inches tall. Take that estimate with a grain of salt, but just this trap alone seems to be able to fit within the space constraints of the Ghost Trap already, with the height limitation being 2.62 inches and the width about 3.31 inches. Dr. Thompson even stated that some people have started to build miniature penning traps using microfabrication on semiconductor chips, so it really could be much smaller if we needed it to be. That being said, the main size issues stem from the magnet in the vacuum itself. According to Dr. Thompson, the typical superconducting magnet used in a penning trap is around a full meter in diameter and 1 to 2 meters in length. Considering this entire Ghost Trap isn't even a meter long, causes some obvious issues. Furthermore, the vacuum pumps used to maintain the vacuum in this portable trap example are about 20 centimeters or 8 inches in each direction, again causing some pretty obvious sizing issues. The solution I proposed, utilizing the freedoms of pseudoscience, is firstly just getting rid of the vacuum system altogether, something that Dr. Thompson also suggested I might have to overlook before I even mentioned it. The vacuum system does play a critical role in ion trapping in the real world, as it's essentially preventing any other molecules from existing within the trap alongside the ions that we want in there. These unwanted air molecules could also cause a multitude of problems, including collisions with the ions that could result in the ions escaping the trap due to energy loss or charge exchange. This is a detail I'm comfortable with overlooking though, as this would be a problem in like every other proposed way I've seen a penning trap or penning trap-like system used in an explanation of the Ghost Trap, including the model used in the Channeling Spirits video. Continuing down this line of thinking, some adjustments would need to be made for the magnet as well. As previously mentioned, the magnet used in the penning traps is a superconducting magnet similar to the ones found in MRI machines. According to Dr. Thompson, the magnetic field would be about 1 to 4 teslas in strength. Other than the size, a few more notable issues arise when translating this technology to the Ghost Trap. For starters, the superconducting magnet is always on, and even if I sized it down with some pseudoscientific magic, having an insanely strong magnet that's attached to you on your hip or sitting next to a bunch of sensitive equipment all the time isn't exactly the greatest idea. But the real issue that I discovered is that a superconducting magnet requires cryogenic cooling in order to operate, usually requiring a large liquid helium bath to achieve, as seen in this figure from Manuel Vogel's book, Particle Confinement in Penning Traps, an Introduction. These conditions aren't exactly achievable even with some liberties taken, so we'll have to pivot. My idea is to use a standard electromagnet, which would essentially adopt the same ring design as the superconducting magnets I've seen in my research, wrapped around the penning trap itself, magnetic field in the center, just without the cryogenic cooling and superconducting materials, instead opting for a conventional conductive material like copper. The whole thing would have to be sized down quite dramatically too, with an outer diameter of maybe around 3 inches or 76 millimeters. To put that in perspective, the 1 meter long long diameter of the superconducting magnet mentioned before is close to 40 inches instead of 3. Plugging in my theoretical electromagnet's dimensions into this hopefully legitimate magnetic field calculator I found online, I get a maximum field strength of about 1070 Gauss, or 0.1 Tesla, if we decrease the thickness of the magnet down to an ideal 1.8 inches. As we can see here in a lecture slide from Dr. Thompson, the optimal strength of a magnetic field for a penning trap operation is 1 to 10 Tesla, basically meaning while we could technically make an electromagnet fit in the parameters of the ghost trap cavity, it would likely not reach the magnetic field strength required to keep the ions in the trap if we were trying to replicate this in the real world. The penning trap is really turning out to be more science fiction than the particle accelerators at this rate. But anyway, science fiction is indeed what we're dealing with here, so real-world application roadblocks be damned. As we can see here, as recently as 2017, there's even been developments in mini superconducting magnets that can reach up to several Tesla and fit in the palm of your hand, utilizing Stirling's cycle cryocoolers seen here that measure to be only around 9 inches in length. Who's to say that a pair of fictional genius scientists couldn't figure out something like this in '84? But regardless of any of those trivial values, the bottom line is that the ghost trap will have to include a penning trap encased by a magnet to work. In our specific situation, most likely a non-superconducting electromagnet so that it can avoid the need for cryogenic cooling and can be toggled on and off easily via the introduction or removal of electricity. As for power consumption, I got a pretty promising response from Dr. Thompson. He says, all the trap does is provide a steady voltage on the electrodes. There's no current flow, so there's no power required. So actually, a battery would be fine. He also went on to say that the voltages are typically something between 10 and 200 volts, which works out fairly well considering our sample battery from earlier barely falls into that range with a nominal voltage of 20.4 volts. I think it's also worth mentioning that the switch to an electromagnet would require some power consumption. The superconducting magnet Dr. Thompson is referring to has no electrical resistance, therefore no power consumption. If we make the switch to an electromagnet, we'll have to account for its power usage. It's pretty hard for me to get an exact number on that though, since I don't actually have the specifications for this magnet that doesn't really exist. But for a ballpark estimate, I found this DC ring electromagnet online that fits my general size estimates at 2 inches tall with a 3-inch diameter. Using the watts and amps it gives me, I can do some quick math using the sample battery from earlier to get an idea for how long we could theoretically run an electromagnet of this size. To figure out the power drawn, we can divide the watts by the voltage of our battery, which gives us about 0.98 amps. We can use this to get an approximate runtime by dividing the amp hours by the amps that we just calculated. The amp hours for our battery is 21,200 milliamperes, or 21.2 amps, so dividing that by 0.98 gives us roughly 21.63 continuous hours of runtime for our theoretical magnet. Given the burst of energy consumed by the X-rays during the actual trapping and the power needed for electrodes, I'm going to generalize a much more conservative number of around 5 to 10 hours of maximum hold time after they've captured a ghost before the battery runs out of juice. This, in my opinion, is plenty of time to get back to the station after a successful bust. Also, if anyone in the comments points out the plot hole of Egon leaving an active ghost trap in his floorboards for months in Afterlife, consider that canonically took place in 2021. The dude had a whole secret lab underneath his house. Who's to say that he didn't implement some wireless charging technology in that little hole? Next, I asked about capacity, in which Dr. Thompson said maximum practical density of ions in a penning trap is somewhere between 1 billion per cubic centimeter. Given the hypothetical example of a trapping volume around 1 liter, we can fit roughly 1 trillion ions into the trap. That's subject to some change though, given the repulsion force of the like-charged ions pushing each other apart versus the actual trapping force one can generate in practice. Regardless, even if 1 trillion ions sounds like a lot, if we take like 1 cubic meter of air, roughly the size of a ghost like Slimer, there's generally considered to be about 25 septillion air molecules in that space of that size. Even if we don't know the specifics, like how densely packed the ions of a ghost are, it might be worth noting that the capacity of the standard penning trap might need to be pseudoscienced a little bit too. crucial detail I've glossed over until now is exactly how the ghost is getting sucked into the trap. I can fortunately tell you that the penning trap is actually completely capable of doing that itself, and that I'm not going to complicate things any further by saying there's another thing like a vacuum hose in here as well. After asking Dr. Thompson about this, to my surprise, he informed me that the penning trap is actually able to attract ions into itself for capture, stating if you put the right electrical potentials on the various electrodes, you can indeed attract particles into the trap, so long as they are not too far away. Going on later to say you would make the end cap electrodes negative to attract particles into the trap, and the ring electrode in the center of the trap would be more negative. He also specified that if we were to load ions into the trap in a traditional way, using an ion beam generated from a separate machine, the ions will have an energy of 100 to 1000 electron volts, which is the same energy that the particles would have if they were attracted from rest towards an electrode that was held at a DC potential of 100 to 1000 volts, and they traveled through a hole in the electrode towards the trap. So if we set the end cap electrode to the right DC potential, we could attract the now positively charged ions into the trap without the need for any additional equipment. The only catch being the distance the particles need to be from the trap in order for this to be successful. Dr. Thompson elaborated on this by saying, if they are any further away, let's say if the distance is much more than the size of the trap, then you would need some sort of intermediate electrode with an appropriate potential to form an ion beam. Considering our example trap is roughly 2 inches long, we can say the ghost would need to be within roughly 2 inches of the trap's entrance in order to be attracted by the electrodes. Since the intermediate electrode is out of the question due to the visuals of the prop itself, the only solution would be to exaggerate the distance a little bit. In theory, if the Ghostbusters really needed to get the ghost closer to the trap than they normally do, they already have the thing lassoed with protons and have the ability to move it around. That's kind of the whole point of the proton pack itself. Dr. Thompson was also able to share some additional details about this process, stating that the presence of magnetic fields is also good because it actively guides the ions into the trap when they come in from the outside. The ions tend to travel along the magnetic field lines, as well as sharing that an energy of 100 electron volts will give ions the velocity of several thousand meters per second typically. All that needs to happen after the entity's ions have made it into the trap is for the user to activate the closing sequence by pressing the pedal a second time. This would obviously close the trap doors, but will also cut off electricity to the X-ray tube, as well as, most importantly, restoring the potential on the end cap electrode of the penning trap, allowing for the entrapment of the ions that we introduced moments before. As long as the penning trap's magnet and electrodes are receiving power, the ghost's ions stay trapped until the battery runs out. And voila, we've just captured a ghost with science. Hypothetically, of course. Alright, so now that we know exactly how the ghost trap captures an entity from top to bottom, the only thing left to cover is the adjustment dials seen all over the trap. I promised you I'd get back to these, here we are. Starting off with the gear-shaped knob on the right side of the trap. Despite appearing in the sketches of the Frozen Empire schematics, this knob isn't actually labeled as anything. The Ectomobile Workshop manual book touches on it briefly too, but describes it as a safety knob that makes sure that the inner cartridge isn't accidentally ejected, which I personally think is kinda lame. The best explanation I found for this knob is OneTime's Muon Trap manual, which describes the knob as a cone adjust dial, which controls the size and shape of the cone of ionizing radiation emitting from the trap during the capture sequence. If we remember from before, OneTime explains that the conic shape of his muon decay radiation is enforced by hollow laser beams, which obviously needs a little bit of an adjustment for our current method of X-rays. You may have noticed I didn't explain how the X-rays were formed into a cone, but that's mostly because they do that naturally when exiting the X-ray tube. On top of inherently having some natural beam divergence, X-rays also have what's called a line focus principle, which basically states that an X-ray's focal spot can change size depending on the angle of the anode within the tube. A steeper angle will reduce the size, and a shallower angle will increase the spread. My ultimate proposal for this knob is to keep the general idea of OneTime's logic just applied to the X-rays, essentially having the knob be responsible for adjusting the cone size by adjusting the anode angle within the X-ray tube to increase or decrease the focal point size, therefore changing the surface area that's affected by the X-rays. And while I'm talking about stuff I didn't mention when going over the X-rays, I wanted to take the time to say that I also won't be worrying about an explanation for the visual look of the cone. I know many people have tried to explain the look of the cone before, including OneTime going into pretty crazy detail at the end of the post seen here, but I didn't think it made much sense to try to explain it visually because of how the Proton pack works. The Proton pack supposedly shoots out a stream of only accelerated protons, and if we were to look at that in real life, it'd be invisible to the naked eye. So if a stream of protons looks like an undulating orange laser beam with bright blue sparks alongside it, then the cone of energy coming out of the trap can look like it does regardless of if it's muon decay radiation or X-rays mixed with an electric field. Next up is the tear-shaped dial on the left. This one has the most interpretations I've seen so far, so I'll try to keep this brief. In the Frozen Empire schematics, this is actually the only dial on the trap that's labeled, and it's identified as the polarization adjustment knob. This might have been some fun little sci-fi jargon thrown in by a designer, considering I couldn't find reference to this phrase anywhere else in my research, nor was I able to find what polarization this was supposed to change. It might have been referring to the electromagnet that was mentioned in the foot pedal schematic page, but I'm not confident on that one. The same dial is referred to as the PKE condenser knob, with a description that claims that the dial is responsible for compacting the ghost in the Ectomobile workshop manual, implying that turning the dial increases some sort of pressure to decrease the physical space taken up by a ghost. Lastly, OneTime keeps it simple by describing it as a preset dial, in which each click is a different preset of different settings, including the aforementioned angle of the anode and the X-ray tube. I love this explanation, and I think it fits the dial nicely, so we'll run with that preset selection route for this one. Now onto the front panel with the remaining 4 dials. As I mentioned before, OneTime references this image as a supposedly screen-used prop that was displayed in the now closed Planet Hollywood location in Washington, D.C. This prop and others like it have detailed labels next to each front panel dial or switch, giving an insight into what their use is, which is essentially the basis for OneTime's entire post. I think now's a good time to mention that I rewatched all of the films several times for this video and discovered that these labels are noticeably absent in every close-up shot of the trap in each movie, notably in every single trap-centric scene like Slimer's capture, the Scoleri brothers' capture, and Vince Clortho's release scene in Afterlife. Regardless of this, apparently some of these props did have labels during the production of at least the first 2 movies, so we'll run with that and the logic in OneTime's post. First up is the legendary NRADS dial. As I mentioned before, OneTime connected this abbreviation to net radiation absorption dose per second, which in turn sparked the line of thinking that led to the inclusion of ionizing radiation, which of course eventually became canon. OneTime described this dial as an adjuster for shielding the trap from the radiation. In his description of the trap's operation, he uses the radiation as an explanation for what's holding the ghost inside the trap too, and claims that the NRADS dial increases an ill-defined shielding mechanism against the radiation in which the trap deploys in accordance to how much radiation is being used to store the ghost. This of course uses up power as well, and as far as I'm concerned, there's no existing way to shield against radiation in a way that's electronically adjustable, nor does OneTime give any explanation as to what's causing the shielding, so again, we pivot. My idea is similar in the sense that this dial will adjust the exposure of the radiation for the users around it, but with a different approach. The strength of the X-rays produced by an X-ray tube is proportionate to the current that's being provided in the tube. This knob will simply just adjust the current flow in the tube, with a smaller current flow resulting in a weaker X-rays and vice versa. Lessening the current flow can conserve charge for the battery when dealing with the weaker or physically smaller ghost, as well as making the potential exposure to users outside the trap less harmful, as the X-rays produced will have less energy, tying it back to the radiation absorption concept. Next up, we have the sync knob. This one is pretty simple. As per usual, I agree with OneTime's interpretation as well. Basically, all this will do is sync the inner cartridge with the outer trap tray once they are connected. If we want to entertain the Bluetooth idea I threw out there a while back after not seeing a physical port connection in Frozen Empire, this knob can act like a Bluetooth connection button on your phone. After that, we have the mode selection switch. The most detail I found on this is similarly from OneTime's post, and I agree with most of it as per usual. The off selection works in tandem with the activation switch I mentioned previously. Power won't flow into the inner cartridge as if this switch is set to off, even if the activation switch on the trap tray is on. Once the switch is moved to any of the other 3 selections, power is transferred into the inner cartridge. The TR selection puts the trap in trap mode, which allows for multiple entrapments to occur until the penning trap inside reaches its ion capacity. The TR+G selection is referred to as the trap and guard mode. This mode locks the trap to one capture sequence only, not allowing the trap to open again until it's being emptied into the containment unit. This mainly will operate as a safety measure as to not accidentally exceed the ion capacity of the penning trap when attempting to capture multiple ghosts. The shortest storage time mentioned in this node as well could also possibly be tied into the X-rays producing the highest amount of energy in this mode, ensuring fast capture but also depleting the battery's charge the most. And lastly, we have the ADF selection, which stands for Auto Detect Function as described by OneTime. In his interpretation, the trap will attempt to detect the PKE level of the entity above the trap and automatically adjust the radiation shielding accordingly. My slightly different approach is to have the same sort of thing happen, just with the trap detecting how many ions are present above the trap and adjusting the power level of the X-rays in accordance to what it finds. Now, unfortunately, OneTime never defines exactly how the trap would go about detecting any of this information about the ghost above it, and unfortunately, I don't really have a strong answer for that either. But I think it's best to keep this consistent with OneTime's post, as I've agreed with him on the function of the rest of the front panel knobs, and the ADF mode, as described in this post, is also directly mentioned in the Frozen Empire schematics as seen here. If I were to assume how this could work with the ghost trap using the technology available to them at the time, I'd assume they'd be using the same technology they used within the PKE meter that could at the very least exist in the back compartment of the trap. But regardless of how it achieves this, the ADF mode will, in theory, automatically adjust to the needs of the job with a reliable sense of accuracy, so it's considered the default selection on the trap mode switch for normal everyday operation as per the Frozen Empire schematics. And finally, we have the NRADS mode switch. These selections all relate to the NRADS dial directly next to the switch. The MAN selection stands for manual, which obviously allows the user to manually adjust the NRADS dial, which will essentially allow the user to freely adjust the power level of the X-rays without limitations on a specific value. The pre-selection stands for preset mode, which allows the user to adjust the X-ray power on the NRADS dial similar to the manual mode, just with 10 separate preset locations that the dial will lock to in this mode. Finally, the GD selection stands for guard mode, which overrides the NRADS dial completely for the trap plus guard mode. This sets the X-ray power output to max and does not allow the NRADS dial to be adjusted until it is switched out of guard mode. And with that, you now know everything you need to know about the ghost trap's in-universe operation. Alright, now we are almost done, but before I go, I promised you guys a full summary of everything I talked about in this video, so I'm going to go ahead and lay out a full breakdown of the trap based on all the information and evidence we've gathered thus far. Also, for those of you joining us from the timestamp at the beginning, welcome. If you're at all confused about anything I'm about to lay out now, I obviously highly suggest watching the full video. So the ghost trap is almost entirely made out of aluminum, with the exposed metal plates on the outside being made from steel. The parts of the trap that are black are likely coated with MOS2 as well. The MOS2 and steel plates help with preventing radiation exposure to the users that aren't standing directly above the trap. On the right side of the trap, we have the electromagnetic heatsink and the trap's resistor, as well as the cone adjust dial that manually changes the size and spread of the X-ray cone by adjusting the anode angle within the X-ray tube. On the left side, we have the 2 ion rods and the preset dial, which allows the user to program and select different preset selections for the several trapping modes and adjustable values found on the trap. The back of the trap hosts a compartment for the battery and electronics, which is pretty self-explanatory. The back panel also features the activation switch, which applies power to the outer trap tray, as well as the occupation indicator, which flashes a red light when an entity has successfully been trapped. The handle and the wheels, I believe, are also pretty self-explanatory. The actual ghost trapping mechanism in the inner cartridge consists of an X-ray tube and a modified penning trap system. When the trap is open, the X-rays are emitted out of the trap and collide with the ghost's negative ions. The X-rays have enough energy to strip the electrons from the ghost's ions, leaving behind positive ions in their place. At the same time, the end cap electrode on the penning trap is emitting a negatively charged electric field, which begins pulling in the ghost's ions as they change into a positive state. Eventually, all the ghost ions will switch charges and be attracted into the penning trap tube via the negative electric field. Once in the trap, the user will press the pedal again to activate the closing sequence, which closes the trap doors, cuts off the power to the X-ray tube, and restores the potential on the end cap electrode of the penning trap. The combination of magnetic and electric fields within the penning trap system then effectively confines the ghost's ions to the inside of the trap until the battery runs out or the ghost is transferred to the containment unit. The bar graph display at the front end of the trap will display how full the penning trap is based on the number of ions captured. And lastly, the front panel contains 4 knobs or dials that either directly adjust the power level of the X-rays or change the trapping mode. If I were to cover each of these in detail now, I'd basically repeat the earlier section on the front panel verbatim, so go see this timestamp here if you're interested in that. And that is it, a full comprehensive pseudoscience breakdown of the in-universe function of the ghost trap, using the currently canon explanations of a penning trap and ionizing radiation. I don't want to take up any more of your time, as I've already taken up about an hour and a half or so, but I wanted to sincerely thank you for watching if you've made it this far in the video. Obviously, consider subscribing or leaving a like or a comment if you'd like to see more pseudoscience breakdowns like this in the future. Huge thank you again to Richard Thompson for all the information on penning traps, and a huge shout out to OneTime and Channeling Spirits for their original ideas that obviously really helped me in the making of this video. Thank you all again for watching, and I really do hope to see you in the next one.